DM retcons round of combat to force me to almost kill a party member. Party composition: human paladin, elf bard, half-elf sorcerer, and orc cleric. A bunch of dudes come to us saying that it was their territory in the city. We start combat, and after a few rounds, I crit smite the big guy with a 3rd level smite, and roll almost full damage. The guy melts inside his armor. DM seems very annoyed, but we keep going. After the entire round passes, DM remembers that the guy I melted had a reaction that he didn't use. So he rewinds the entire round and makes the guy create some sort of portal that makes me hit the bard. It goes without saying that the amount of damage I did was enough to make the bard go unconscious, and the damage was like 2 points short of an insta-kill. We abandoned the campaign shortly after. Retconning in a story can be fine. Sometimes you make mistakes and agree to remedy them. But retconning in combat? First off, your players are going to think this is total BS no matter what you do. And second off, you think your players remember their hit points from last turn? Half of them barely remember how many spell slots they have right now, or half the abilities they've had since level 1. And you want them to go back a turn?
Why would you say something so controversial yet so brave?
My name is Jacob Crowe, and welcome to the Crowe's Perch. Players. As a DM, you love them. Mostly. Especially when they get really into a game. It can have some great outcomes. Everyone getting into character, drawing art of the campaign, posting about it on social media and bragging about how cool the game you run is. And sometimes you have the opposite. A game where you feel like you have to drag your players to get them to the other side of it. A game where you catch a new player on their phone playing Candy Crush. Oh my god, level 69. Nice! And another who doesn't even like RPGs, but thought it'd make for a nice Facebook post to send to Felicia Day for the brief chance that she'd date them. I know the guild came out like 15 years ago, but I'm still holding out hope. But have you ever had a player like the one in our next story? One that was so bored and uninterested with the game, he decided to pick a fight with the DM. And when I say fight, I mean a real fight. Not what two nerds have over Discord when they're having an argument over how sexy their favorite Pokemon is.
If you tell me that Gardevoir isn't fuckable one more time, we are no longer friends.
All I'm saying is that if you look at Lopunny, you can clearly tell who the superior...
And so, without further ado, let's put up our fisticuffs as we gather up a murder and dive right into this story. This story is from when I was in college, freshman 2nd semester. This is important because if you think the people in this story are immature, that's because we were. So, I had only been in 2 D&D games before, as a player at this point. So I wanted to shoot my shot at being a DM. So I hopped on the GroupMe for our apartment and made a recruitment post. Had a group of 5 players, but only one in this story is important. I'll call him Grumpy. Grumpy came to me and told me he was an experienced player who had been playing dozens of games before, but he didn't like that I was going to be running the campaign in 5th edition. He recommended Pathfinder. He told me how much better and customizable it was, over a series of texts filled with links to resources, but I declined. I was new, and tackling the rulebook I already looked at twice before felt overwhelming. So I wasn't confident in running anything but 5th edition. He seemed a bit upset about it, but ultimately decided to sign up anyway. Session 0. We're making our characters. There were 2 fresh new players at the table, so we took our time in slowly building out their characters. I am a heavy role player who loves world building, so I informed everyone that the campaign would be homebrew in terms of the plot. Grumpy then brought up a question about homebrew classes and races, which I fearfully declined. Grumpy questioned how I could make a homebrew story without homebrew characters and classes, and I didn't have a solid answer. He then laughed it off and simply told me he'd be running a min-max human ranger hunter build, which I had no idea what it was at the time, so I kinda let it go. 6 sessions later, And I'm fed up with Grumpy. His hunter was more powerful than I thought, so I thought about increasing the difficulty of the mobs, but didn't want to punish the other players either. He also didn't seem interested in any NPCs, never talked to anyone except for the occasional vendor to buy something, but what was worse is that he was oozing with the body language of someone who obviously wasn't tuned in. Occasionally rolling his dice, even though there was nothing to roll for, looking at his phone most of the time, occasional sighs and stretches after long moments of pure silence. After one session, I got with him over text to try and brainstorm a potential side quest for his character, and he said something along the lines of, "Huh, sure," and "cool," without much feedback. Now for the final session. I intended this session to be mostly roleplay and some skill checks, but no combat. They were in a new town, so it was time to introduce NPCs, quest givers, and restock. The session had gone on for about 3 hours at this point, and a player wanted to know the price of an item. I pulled out my book to search for an answer, and cue the long wait time. Grumpy was extremely bored, so he did all his usual things before leaning forward to grab a dice out of the big bag of dice we had centered in the table and tossed it at me. I assumed it was to get my attention, and it missed, so I ignored it. The second one hit me in my chest, and I was peeved. So I shot a look at him, which Grumpy proceeded to smile about before tossing a third at my face. I grabbed the entire bag of dice and threw it at him, sending the contents spilling on the lobby floor. After that, we were on each other. Table and chairs knocked over. The classic college tussle, but with extra dice. Hard to tell which one of us was more flocked up by the end of it, but we both got a good few blows in. The players pulled us apart, and we cursed at each other before the RA came in. He gave us a warning. He was a fairly nice guy. Had us clean everything up, but during the cleanup, I told everyone I was officially done hosting the campaign. Went on a long hiatus after that. Didn't touch Dungeons and Dragons for like 2 years. Thought I wasn't cut out for it. Words of wisdom. If you want to fight a player at the table, take the rulebook with you for extra bludgeoning damage. I mean, that's a lesson, I guess. Obviously, you shouldn't beat up your players, but... As for Grumpy, there are a lot of players like you, unfortunately, who really just want to play a different game. And that's completely fine. Valid even. But you want to know what isn't fine? Picking on your new DM, harassing them, and throwing dice at them when they're looking up rules like you're some kind of 4-year-old begging for attention. You sure as hell got it. And hopefully a couple of D4s stuck in your foot. Now let's take out the trash and move on to the next story now, shall we? Bad player? That's one thing. Bad DM? Well, that opens up a whole new can of worms, as we will soon find out in our next story. In this story, we'll find out what happens when an asshole DM makes an entire kingdom full of assholes. And so, without further ado, let's convince all of our players that realism is when everything is colored gray and people are mean all the time for no reason, as we gather up a murder and dive right into this next story. I was playing in an online 5th edition game that was advertised as having a focus on realism. The DM and party seemed nice, and in our session 0, the DM said that he was going for a more realistic game, but that no classes or races would be restricted. He said that he did have a few homebrew rules, but that he would get to them when they came up, as he wanted us to discover them organically. The game starts with the party arriving in a town in search of work. Things immediately got off to a bad start as we came to understand what realism meant to this DM. For starters, every, and I mean every, NPC was not only gleefully described as the DM as being covered in mud and shift, but were also all a-holes to the party for no reason. A common exchange when we try to purchase something went like this. Merchant, What do you want arrows for, killer? Ranger, to kill things. That's what, arrows are for. Why are you selling them if they're so bad? Merchant, I don't need to explain myself to you. Apart from that, we also saw the welcome sight of a young girl being burned at the stake for the crime of practicing magic. Turned out magic was illegal in this kingdom, which the DM had just so happened to omit. After spending an hour looking for any sort of plot hook from stonewalling NPCs, we eventually find out there's an abandoned mine nearby that was taken over by goblins. We figure that maybe these villagers are hostile to outsiders out of fear, and figure reclaiming their mine might make them more amicable to us. We joke that maybe it would make everyone stop being an a-hole, to which the DM replied that not everyone was like that. So in our first encounter with the goblins, the DM reveals his custom injuries tables. See, most lasting wounds tables apply effects on a crit. This DM, however, not only had almost every critical hit result in dismemberment of some sort, but even just being hit would give the player character a 50% chance of the wound getting infected, and them dying within a couple of days unless the wound was treated immediately, which was exceedingly difficult because, again, healing magic was illegal. We somehow managed to kill the goblins, with our paladin losing a hand in the process and going unconscious, and make off with a meager amount of loot the goblins had accrued. As soon as we exit the mine, however, the entire town's villagers are present, as well as the local lord and his knights, who demands that we give him the gold we'd looted, saying that we stole it? We're all tired of these a-hole NPCs at this point, so we refuse. Combat ensues, with the DM snickering that it sure would be useful to use your spells right about now, as our wizard and druid had been stuck up until this point, using their starting weapons to try and do at least something. They didn't take the bait, and kept up their subpar actions. Somehow, we managed to crit this lord twice, and cut off both of his legs, to which this lord not only doesn't have to make any con saves, but just calls the party outlaws and criminals and gallops away, legless. When we complained about this, the DM says, "He's a trained warrior from birth. He can withstand wounds." Again, he got both his legs cut off.
Look, you stupid bastard, you've got no arms left.
Yes, I have.
Look!
Just a flesh wound.
The peasant mob disperses after we give them all our money, and the party collectively decide to leave this kingdom, saying that everyone was an a-hole, to which the DM again protests that not everyone was, even though we had only ever interacted with jerks. After the DM tries everything to get us to stay in this land, saying there's bandits on the road, we wouldn't know anything about the surrounding area, our characters would want to stay. The DM finally relents as we just pick a random direction and start walking. The session ends, and 2 days later, the DM says on the party server that he decided it would be most realistic for the party to have caught and died from the flu while traveling cross-country, and to have died, and for us to roll new characters. We all tell the DM to go flock himself as he pastes paragraphs of text telling us we were bad players for not appreciating and understanding how things really were back then. We all left as the DM was midway through his diatribe. TLDR, DM thinks realism equates to mudcore and everyone being a-holes. Shitty DMs and realism campaigns. Name a more iconic duo. I swear that word has lost all meaning at this point. Here's a tip for anyone else wanting to do a game like this. Realism isn't people are always mean and limbs fly off every attack. That's parody. Not that any edgelord that runs a campaign like this understands what parody means, but here we are. But anyway, those were today's stories, and these are my thoughts, and I would like to see what your thoughts are of today's stories in the comments down below. And before we end today's video, how can I forget? Art of the Week. Art of the Week!
Now, this is a voice I bet you haven't heard in quite some time.
as we are dallying forth into Art of the Week. This week's Art of the Week is based in a challenge, where I had my viewers draw the Crowe and one of their characters as edgelords. Now let us see what they've come up with. Drum roll, please. And the winner of the Edgelord art event is Kemvaar. This piece is fantastic, depicting the Crowe in his rightful place, mugging a bard, alongside Kemvaar's own character, hiding in the darkest shadows of the corner of the tavern, as any edgelord is wont to do. Your praises shall be sung high and low to any burb that can hear it, and your art shall be forever hung in the Art Hall of Fame. But I have had several submissions sent to me from many other creators, like Vincent, Starlight Archer, Gen Geriu, Mordecai 95, Duffbone, Razzie Matazid, Raximus Prime 2323, Vasis, Taffy, and of course our runner-up, Burrito.
Every time I do a challenge like this, I am just constantly surprised. You guys make incredible art, and I just like showing it off on the channel. I can't wait until the next event in March, and I'm excited to see what you guys come up with. But before we end today's video, a special thank you to our patrons. Patrons like Reuven Gritters, or Accounts of Quills, Gibber Woods, King Drazil, Christian Pip, Cosmosis, Kooky Spooks, Rikus, Vincent, Haley Thompson, Zero Fang, and Netscape Navigator. And after that is our barons of Beaks, like Jester King, Gintahl, Misfit, Wormy, Matthew Mulqueeny, Den of the Drake, McEatley, and Anya. And of course we have our Dukes of Feathers, like Staniel Das Boot, Rogue the Cleric, Henna, General Constantine Chase, Happy Rex, Stevie, Doc Salty 96, and Acroth. Thank you so much for your support, and if you would also like to support the channel, be sure to follow the link to my Patreon in the description down below. And with all of that out of the way, I will see you next time as the crow flies.